everybody. It's day 86, and I wanted to give you a little bit of hope with a more positive message related to our eco issues. And I wanted to talk to you today about heroes. So I want to introduce you to one of my biggest heroes. Dun dun dun! Wait a second. He's not wearing a spandex outfit with a cape. Not really wearing a uniform at all. It's not typically what you would think of as a hero in today's Hollywood society. But this is my hero. This is, of course, somebody that most people don't even know or have never heard of. His name is Clair Patterson. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to explain to me who Clair Patterson is and then why he's a hero. Specifically, he's one of my biggest heroes. He should be yours too, if you know a bit about him, right? So pause it. Write down the question, take a good look at him, whatever that thing is over there, right? And figure out why this guy's a hero. All right, let's take this on together, right? Now, Clair Patterson, you can figure out a lot just by looking at him, right? His friends called him Pat. Just by looking at his outfit, this is like 1960s classic science nerd gear, right? He's got the button up that's got sleeveless, right, or short sleeve button up. We're rocking a pocket protector and classic 1960s glasses, right? Looks like he works at NASA. So good news is Pat is a scientist. He's a nerdy fellow, and he's one of the nerdiest of all the nerdy scientists, those with true patience, called rockhounds, geologists, right? So Pat is a scientist and a geologist, and he should be really famous because one thing he figured out was pretty handy. We live on this thing called planet Earth. And how old is planet Earth? Well, scientists will say that it's 4.6 billion years-ish, right? How do we know that? Because of Pat, right? Pat did a really cool thing. He used uranium decay, and over a long, long period, he figured out the age of the Earth and figured out it's pretty darn close to 4.6 billion years if you round it, right? And he did this based on the idea of uranium decay. And uranium, of course, was deposited in the Earth by meteors and the formation of the Earth. And as it's done that, a proportion of it has decayed and become, because it's radioactive, lead over time. And if you know how much uranium should have been there by looking at samples from space like meteors, and you compare that to what we find on the Earth's rocks today, you can figure out, hey, how much of the uranium turned into lead? And he figured out by that, and a lot of really good work with his thing called the very first clean room in the United States to get rid of contamination, how old the Earth was. So thank you, Pat, for filling us in on how long this rock's been around and how long life's been able to evolve on it, right? The second thing that he did, of course, was pretty crucial. He noticed something. He found that his research in the age of the Earth was really hard because every time he looked at samples, there was more lead than there should be. And he's like, something's wrong with this. And so he continued to look for samples, and he found out that it wasn't his technique. It was the fact that there was actually too high a lead levels everywhere on Earth. And that kind of scared him and made him curious. So he continued his research into lead. And as he was doing that, he ultimately wanted to find the source of this and why all these lead levels were too high. The concern for that being that lead, if you've never heard of it, it's an endocrine disruptor. It blocks cell signaling, and it's a neurotoxin. It literally blocks neurotransmitters from being sent from one nerve to the next, so it shuts down nerves. This shouldn't be a surprise when we think about ancient Rome. The symbol for lead, Pb, comes from plumbum, the Latin term for it, and they used it in their plumbing, and that was, of course, the pipes that they used to run the water into their houses, and, well, that causes lead poisoning. And what that ultimately does, of course, is it causes developmental delay in kids, prevents their brains from forming correctly, reducing their IQ dramatically. It causes dementia in adults because it's basically blocking the nerves, which drops IQ and causes memory loss, right? This might explain one of the reasons why Rome fell. They used to add lead to their wine to sweeten it because it's a sweet metal. It's also why kids with old paint used to eat paint chips because it tasted sweet, and unfortunately, it damages your brain. It also can lead to insanity because then your brain doesn't fire correctly, and cancer because it's involved in cell signaling pathways, and it eventually can lead to death. And that's in very small doses. It's a highly toxic metal. So he was worried about this, logically, because everywhere he looked, he was finding extremely high lead levels, enough to poison folks. And it doesn't take much to poison it, and it was much higher than that, right? So he wanted to know where the actual source of this was. So he continued in his research, and he searched for the source of lead, and he went from pole to pole. He went to Greenland and up into the Arctic. He went all the way down to Antarctica. He went to the deep oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. Years and years of research and taking samples, and he found lead almost everywhere. But one place that he didn't find it was he didn't find it in the deep ocean. He found it in the surface waters, but not in the deep ocean. Now, that's a big deal because the ocean has these wonderful currents inside of it. And basically, within 100 years, what was at the top could circulate to the bottom and spread evenly throughout it. But he was only finding these high levels of lead in the surface waters, which meant they hadn't had time to precipitate down to the deeper waters. So this was a new problem within the last 100 years, right? And if it was that much of a new problem, it probably wasn't a geologic event like some suggested. It was a new thing in terms of it was a man-made issue, and it was a man-made source. And eventually figures out that the lead contamination is new. It is a man-made source. And then, he publishes his paper that this is a problem. He gets into Nature, one of the best scientific journals that you can publish in. Love to get into that someday. And what he proves is awesome, that there's this lead issue and it's contamination, and it's a new thing. And most people would have stopped right then and sat back on their laurels. Instead, he wanted to know what the source was. And so he continued his research, and through his research, he eventually discovers the source, and he publishes that, right? And it turns out that the source of all this lead is a thing called tetraethyl lead. You can see a picture of it right next to my head. There's my tetraethyl lead right there, right? And what it is an unnecessary fuel additive to fight this thing called engine knock. Early engines used to sputter a lot, knock, because they figured there's some issue here, and the lead that they added to it, they proposed would actually reduce the engine knock and cause it to not do that anymore. And the beauty of that is that created this thing called leaded gasoline. And the tetraethyl lead adds the lead to it. They added this to the petrol, the gasoline, and suggested that it would remove the engine knock. And by doing that, it added increased cost to the actual gasoline. So you could sell it for more because it had the anti-knock in it. Turns out it actually didn't have much of an impact on the knock. What they eventually had to do was invent better carburetors and better fuel standards so they didn't have water inside the line and they get proper oxygen. But it made the oil industry money. So, hey, put it in all of them, right? And then, of course, what goes into the engine burns up and comes out the other end, out the tailpipe, right? So the neat thing about this is he proves that this is the source of this thing, and he proposes in his paper, and a lot of people take notice of it, but the first ones to take notice of it are, of course, the oil companies. And as he proposes this source of this stuff, the oil companies immediately, within a couple of days, come and visit him at Stanford, I believe he was at that time. And what they do is they, of course, applaud him on his research and offer him unlimited funding if he stops doing his lead research and goes on to something else. This is an attractive thing because if you know how science works in the United States, you are always scrounging for grants. So I haven't gone for my PhD yet. Grants to try to do the research, and you've got to get companies or institutions to provide those for you, right? And ironically, the ones that were actually supplying the funding for his research around the world, because it was tied in with petroleum deposits, were the petroleum industry, what we call the petrochemical industry, the oil industry. And since he wouldn't cut out his research, they cut off his funding. They actually pressured the university to fire him. He was removed from his position. He spent the next 30 years being chased from basically each institution that he went to, and losing his job, losing his credibility, being basically harassed by the oil companies, but he stuck with it. And the thing with this is Pat's research eventually proves that the source of this pollution on Earth is car exhaust and the oil industry. That's why they went after him so hard. And he proves the health impacts that are located with that. So that, of course, is why he lost that funding. Fortunately, he worked really hard and scrounged funding from things like the Energy Commission of the United States, the military as well. And through that hard work and perseverance in the face of huge economic trouble and social stigma from other scientists because, if they supported him, they would lose their funding as well. He still was able to get enough research to prove that it was car exhaust that was the source of this. It was the oil industry's adding of that to it. That's ultimately the source of the tetraethyl lead, and that it was causing elevated levels in the blood of children in the United States and around the world. And we're talking elevated levels that are like 1,200 times what he proved were in Peruvian mummies from the time before man was using tetraethyl lead. He proved the new normal. Now, the amazing thing about this is he, for 30 years, lobbied Congress and fought against the oil industry, basically single-handed, and bad science of an individual called Dr. Kehoe that was actually was the recognized expert on this, and was funded by the oil industry through a thing called the Ethyl Corporation, that they tried to prove that tetraethyl lead had no impact in humans. This lead contamination was completely normal. Oh, this is you shouldn't listen to this scientist. He eventually, after 30 years of lobbying Congress, going and testifying before Congress, showing his evidence, collecting evidence, all on funding that was greatly reduced because the oil industry was trying to cut his funding strings, he eventually proves to Congress. And in 1975, they put this awesome ban that banned leaded gasoline. Essentially what it did was it phased out all leaded gasoline use in cars after 1975, stating that it would damage their catalytic converters, which it would, and it would do far more than that. So it was a gradual phase out. But thank goodness they did that, because right after that phase out, the lead levels in Americans, especially American children, decreased by 80%. And the rate, of course, of health concerns related to those things like dementia and developmental issues that would be caused by those greatly decreased. Now, what does that mean? That means that this man single-handedly did an amazing thing. He saved the earth and you from our own stupidity. We didn't need to put lead in gasoline, and we still did it because it made money. It made them a lot of money. So instead of listening to evidence from a true scientist looking at his data, for a long time, industry convinced the Congress that it was perfectly fine because industry should regulate itself. And this is just one major example that is not okay. And that is a major push of what's going on right now in the world, that industry is being put in charge of regulating its own environmental conditions. Kind of sounds familiar, right? This is just a prime example that is probably not the best idea, since those that make money off something probably don't want to regulate and tell themselves not to do it. The coal industry, the petrochemical industry. That kind of sounds familiar, right? Now, what this means, of course, is also, you should consider this. This is why my children do not have lead in their bodies at the levels that would cause their brains to not form correctly. This is why you do not have those huge lead levels. This is why it's not showing up in your food, in your paint, not being sprayed out of the back end of everybody's car in the United States to basically poison all of us and cause the fall of Rome like it did before, right? There might be a reason why Nero went insane. Oh, lead poisoning. He drank a lot of wine with lead in it. So if we look at this, that's why this guy, Pat Patterson, this unassuming fellow, is my hero. He is my hero because, of course, he single-handedly did this. And this is pretty amazing because that is not the norm, and we need a lot more people like that to make the changes that we now face, which are even greater than the lead poisoning. But this is just one example of a simple little thing that should have been fixed and recognized, and took the efforts of one man to actually get the world to turn around. Now, I have to say that it's banned in quotes, air quotes, because leaded gasoline can still be used in light aircraft in the United States. It can still be used in other countries in the world, and this fight still needs to continue because hopefully you recognize that with the currents in the atmosphere and the ocean, the entire surface of the world is connected. So we need to continue the work of Pat, not only with lead, but with things like CO2, water vapor, which both come out of the tail ends of cars and are greenhouse gases, and methane that comes from things like, meat production and all this waste that comes from it, right? So, with that said, that's why Pat Patterson is my hero. He took on tetraethyl lead. He took on the oil industry. He took on the powerful powers to be that were there in Congress. And he fought based on evidence. He fought based on his heart of what was right for his own children and for everybody else's children. We could take that beyond to not just human life on Earth, but life of all of Earth, the things that keep us alive. So Pat Pat's my hero. And so my homework for you is to be a little more like Pat. Use evidence, use reasoning, use your heart to say, hey, is this right? Is there something better than just making money in the world? Or is it better for us to recognize, hey, let's use the evidence that's in front of us, think about this, and then get that word out to people? Because that's what he did. He shunned what could have been a very illustrious career, highly paid by the oil companies to do research and anything he desired. He chose the higher path that was not as financially conducive and lucrative. He chose to go with what was right, and that was to tell people the wrong that was being done with lead, to work his whole life to get it banned. And then, he later got recognized with some awards, but it's pretty sad that this isn't the hero that everybody gets to see, because there's a lot of heroes that are like him in the shadows. So my of course, challenge is to you is to be a little more like Pat. Be a little nerdy. Be a little honest. Use evidence to actually support what you're saying. I put at the bottom this, of course, ways that you can find out more. There's an awesome Wikipedia to find out greater detail on what was going on with his fight for lead banning, as well as his discoveries of the age of the Earth. Included with that, you can get a really good idea and visuals with this with a Cosmos episode with a different Neil. And that Neil, of course, will do a wonderful job of telling the story of Pat Patterson and his clean room. It's the clean room episode. I highly suggest that you check it out. So my challenge to you is be a little more like Pat. Maybe not in dress, but at least in thinking. Fight for truth, get the word out, help people think and make correct decisions. Because if you put the evidence in front of them, they can't claim ignorance anymore. And if they make the bad decision, that's just stupidity. But that can be cured and fixed over time with enough people with the right thing in their heart and the right knowledge in their brain and sharing it. So get the word out. Thanks, Pat. You're my hero.